Okay, good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the public part of the third meeting in 2014 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. I say the public part because we've already taken item 1 in private. Can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile devices as they do affect the broadcasting system? But having said that, some committee members do consult their papers in digital format. So item 2 today is the draft third National Planning Framework. We're going to have a roundtable session on this framework, and we have a number of experts and stakeholders here today to discuss a range of issues covered in the proposed NPF 3, which relate to the committee's remit, which is namely transport, housing, Scottish water and digital infrastructure. So can I welcome Professor Glenn Bramley, Director of the Institute of Housing, Urban and Real Estate Research at Heriot-Watt University, David Connolly, Director of Technical Development from Sistra, Professor Michael Foreman, Professor of Computer Systems at the University of Edinburgh, Professor Geoffrey Gooch, Chair of Water and Environmental Policy at the Scottish Centre for Water Policy, Derek Haldane, Consultant, Derek Haldane Consultancy, John Lauder, National Director of Scotland Sustrans, Phil Matthews, Chair of Transform Scotland, and we're hoping that Ewan Wallace, the Chair of the Society of Chief Officers of Transports in Scotland, will join us shortly. So, gentlemen, if I could start off by asking, could the transport and digital infrastructure policies and developments set out in NPF 3 be improved to better achieve the government's ambition for Scotland of being a connected place? Who would like to start? Don't all go at once, John Lauder.
I'm happy to start. We very much welcome the inclusion of the proposal to have a national walking and cycling network. I think that's a very good idea. We're very happy to work with government to develop that further. In terms of how this might be improved, from a practical point of view, we think that in the chapter titled Connected Place, point 526, and in the chapter entitled Natural Resilient Place, the point listed 4.13 could be combined very effectively, where the proposal could be to have a sustainable transport town in each local authority area, aimed at both a green transport future and also encouraging people to be more active. Where we think that this proposal could be strengthened would be, certainly from the active travel perspective, would be to place an emphasis on behaviour change in terms of engagement with people, and not only about capital investment in terms of infrastructure. One proposal that we might make would be that capital funding could be spent on what would ostensibly be a resource funding idea, which would be active travel and engagement with people through personalised travel planning, but actually use capital funding for that. The principle being that in order to get people to use active travel facilities and infrastructure more effectively, you do need to engage with them. And the principle of build it and they will come, we know from lots of experience and lots of evidence, doesn't necessarily work. So if you can combine engagement with people and the ability to use good quality infrastructure that works effectively, that would be really strong. So a proposal that we would like to make would be that capital investment could be used to fund behaviour change programmes.
Okay, I'm not sure how that could be done, but that's an interesting suggestion. Derek Haldane.
Yes, well, just to follow up that point, since it's an area we've been active in including the work we did for Scottish Government on the Smarter Travel work last year that was published in May, where some of what John said was one of the specific recommendations. We also do a lot of work with the retail sector, development projects, supermarkets, that sort of stuff. And the idea that we'd build a new supermarket and not market it is just fantasy. And so I think there needs to be, a reality check that actually we're doing far too much government expending, not just walking, cycling, but roads and railways, and we're not getting the marketing right. And, basic things like we've got smart ticketing on the planes with electronic boarding passes and on parking, mobile phone parking, all this stuff, but we can't even get the basics like that for public transport. These are not trivial issues about making it easy to pay for transport, easy to use it, good and well-informed systems. And just as we've seen companies like Tesco move from generalised marketing programmes to very personalised ones like Clubcard, government needs to move from very generalised promotion of social messages to very personalised ones, which is where things like personal travel planning come from. We say, well, here's how we can work with you to help you succeed, how you get into work, get a job. And these personalised programmes are, at one level, sort of a separate issue from an infrastructure investment type thing, and could be said, oh, well, they're out there, but actually so fundamental to the success of government providing leadership and transport that I don't think we can ignore them completely in this type of framework. So I suppose what I'm saying is we need to look more broadly at the way that the plan integrates with wider society, where the economic growth in society is going to come from. And I can go back to a number of detailed points as we get on through the discussion, but I think the critical one at this stage is consumers spend about 90 to 93% of all the spending on transport in Scotland at the minute. The other 7 to 10% comes from government, depending how you score things like warehouses and things like this. So I think a good parameter to go by is if we're going to spend £1 of public money on, let's say, building a new road, where are the 9 coming from consumers? Because that would be pro rata with the transport economy as a whole. And one of the problems with publishing something, a national planning framework, is it's then a hostage to fortune. Government will be held to account unless it actually pays for and delivers everything in there. So much more clarity is needed on who pays for what. Because I think, yes, we need some of this stuff to be locked in as, yes, we need a planning framework for it to happen, but that doesn't mean government needs to put any money into it. And I think if we had greater clarity about what government was going to pay for and what government wasn't going to pay for, then I think that would be a huge help. So anyway, that's enough for a kick-off comment.
Professor Foreman.
I had some comments on the inclusion of digital, which first of all is to be welcomed, but then I think it doesn't go deep enough. It's quite sketchy, to say the least. So you mentioned the investment in fibre that's going on under the Step Change programme up in the Highlands and Islands. The map doesn't even include the fibre that exists in various forms in the rest of Scotland, and there's no real attention to this as a national infrastructure. In particular, there's no talk about how we access that infrastructure. So, as far as I can see it here, I see the picture as being, we'll make sure that BT, in this case, build it, and it's up to them how it gets used. And the problem with this infrastructure is there's a natural monopoly, and so it may be up to them how it gets used, but there's very little incentive to them to improve it. There's no competition, there's not those kinds of drivers, so there ought to be more attention to the ways that it gets used within the strategy. And at the moment, it's rather like having a strategy for motorways without saying, and there will be on and off ramps at various communities where they will be useful. And not only the people who work for the owners of the motorway can build businesses along it, but other people can build businesses by putting their own lorries, trucks and cars along it freely. So we need to make sure not only that the infrastructure is in the ground, which is much to be welcomed, but that it's accessible to lots of different kinds of businesses in lots of different kinds of ways. And I don't think that will happen naturally.
We will explore that further in specific questions about that. Professor Bramley.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to follow up Derek Holden's point about greater clarity about who's going to fund what. And I think one of my strong themes would be that, particularly in the major growth areas of Scotland, I think most of the infrastructure is going to have to be funded by the development. I don't think there's going to be, we're in a situation where there is going to be a very generous supply of public investment resources to actually provide the level and quality of infrastructure that we aspire to have within the rest of this plan document to support those developments. I think we haven't been getting it right. If you look at major developments around Edinburgh, like the South East Wedge, why has this taken so long to build out when it was first identified in the mid-1990s? I think largely due to confusion about and lack of clarity about who's paying for the infrastructure. In my view, the right way to go is that for a large part of that it should be paid for by the development through a proper tariff system reinforced through planning agreements, as was developed quite successfully in some of the growth areas in southern England. Yeah.
Can I just ask you, how do we build that capacity in local authorities to enforce that?
Well, I think that it would help if the Scottish Government's own Planning Policy Directorate was more wholehearted in support of this approach. Thank you.
Professor Gooch.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity to come here and provide comments. I'd like to start off with a few words about the central area for our centre in Dundee. And looking through the planning document, I see that there are perhaps 3 areas which we would like to see more closely connected in a slightly different way than they are at the moment. And these are flood defence, which of course is a major issue, especially considering the possibilities of climate change. But there are also the issues of ecosystem services and river basin management plans. And the reason I'm starting off with this is because I think it could be clearer that flood defence actually starts way up in the catchment and not at the point of problematic issues when the flood is there. And perhaps it's not directly within the remit of this committee, but we would like to point out that the reason that there are increase in floods is a lot to do with land use up in the catchments. And ecosystem services, one of those is, of course, flood prevention or flood minimisation. I think that could come clearer out, even if it does involve a shift perhaps between the land use strategy and this committee.
Would you like to be a bit more specific about the type of land use that's preventing?
Well, obviously, if we're talking about percolation of water into the soil, which is retaining the water, which then prevents the flash floods, basically, or minimises the flash floods, it does have to do with, for example, forestry trees allow percolation into the water to a very much larger extent than they do for hard-packed agricultural land, which is being used with heavy machinery. So you get a much faster runoff from that sort of agricultural land. And in fact, planting perhaps parts of trees to provide that percolation and to provide that holding back of the water is a possibility. We've been conducting work, as I'm sure you know, as a pilot study in the Tweed Basin and the Eddlestone, where, among other things, the straightened out river, which is honestly a catastrophe as far as floods are concerned, is being put back into a meandering river with natural floodplains. Now, of course, this is a major issue, and it does involve the agricultural community and loss of agricultural land. But as we're seeing the increase of the number of floods and the severity of the number of floods, I think it has to be taken into account that one way of managing is not flood defence at the point of where it's a problem, but much further up in the system, into that ecosystem. So it's a question of putting back the meandering in the rivers, perhaps allowing floodplains, natural floodplains, and planting forests to allow percolation of the water and retainment in the land to avoid these flash floods, which are being more usual.
And Mr. Matthews?
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to just start by saying a few words about the sort of vision within the MPF and how it relates to transportation and connectivity issues. And how it sits within the wider government framework, and then with some comments on some of the particular projects that are identified as national priorities. I think our view in terms of the vision is fine. It talks about successful, sustainable, it talks about low carbon, it talks about natural resilient places, connected places, that's all fine. When you then look at how it's all dissected between different different sectors of investment. Low carbon is primarily focused on renewables and the energy supply industry. That's fine. Transport is 25% of our carbon emissions. It's the one sector that's not going down in the way that others are. And there's very little within the connectivity and transport section on carbon emissions. So I think that's a major concern. I think secondly, we would say that we don't really see the logic in the proposals that are deemed to be national priorities within the MPF3. There doesn't seem to be consistency in terms of the scale of projects, in terms of their stage of development, and so on. We don't really see... Well, most of it, if I could just say, the connection is with the infrastructure investment, the IIP document. Most of the major road and rail programs, projects have been taken forward through that document, which has not been subjected to parliamentary scrutiny in the same way, which has not been subjected to public consultation in the same way. And there are much larger projects in that which are not being taken through the MPF, and smaller projects that are being taken through the MPF. So we don't really see the consistency. We're not really clear why the projects that have been selected through this. And we tend to see the two as two aspects of the same thing, which is about, in terms of transport, the infrastructure in connectivity and transport.
Some examples?
Well, as I said, the major road schemes, the A96, the A9 dualling schemes, the investment in rail infrastructure and so on, they are not within infrastructure within Scotland. They are not within the MPF3. They are being taken forward through the IIP.
They are mentioned. They are mentioned.
They're mentioned, but they're not the national projects.
So are you saying that these shouldn't go ahead, or?
What I'm saying is that there's it's unclear what the methodology is that has selected these projects as national priorities. And excluded others from that. And I think in terms of assessing transport, it would be very useful if we could assess the transport investment as a whole, and that includes the IIP and what's in the MPF3 together. And we feel it's difficult to get a firm handle on a strategic overview, essentially, of how the investment is undertaken, if the two are not necessarily linked in the way they should be. So
are you saying that connecting our cities in Scotland is not a major priority or a major strategic? No, I'm saying exactly the opposite. It is a major priority, so it's interesting that those projects are not within the MPF3. We might not necessarily agree with certain ones of those projects. We might not see them as priorities. But as I said, to turn your argument round, they're not within the MPF3. And I would question why that is, given, as you say, that they are the priority projects in terms of connectivity. I would also, if I could just give another couple of examples, there are three investment in ports projects identified within the MPF3. There's nothing on rail freight within that, and we don't really see why that is. Airport expansion is included with MPF3. Each of those airports already has a master plan in place. We understand that's stated within the MPF3, so we don't see what the need of the MPF to focus on that really is as part of priority investment when, for example, the electrification of the Scottish rail network, the investment in intercity connections in Scotland is not part of that. I'm detecting a central belt view here, but we'll carry on.
I'm from Aberdeen, actually, and my priority in North Scotland, what we'd say is we would argue that they'd say the Highland Mainline Rail the upgrade of that is much more important than some of the other schemes that have been talked about there. And again, I would refer you back to the principles there and the vision about sustainable and low carbon, and I question whether some of the projects, the 96 dualling, etc., is necessarily consistent with that as well.
If we can move on then, can I ask if you believe that the policies and developments set out in NPF3 equally benefit people living in cities, towns, rural areas, coastal and island communities, and if not, how could they be amended to ensure that all areas benefit as far as possible equally from improvement? Yes, Mr. Connolly.
I'll start on that. I think it would be impossible to achieve equality in the outcomes of your investment across the whole of Scotland. And in particular, the strategy obviously identifies areas where there's clusters of development and the Forth Estuary and the Aberdeen North East and so forth. And I think that's correct, because I think you will get a better return for your investment by targeting and focusing and building hubs where the combination of skills and workforce come together. And if you were to try and spread your investment across the whole of Scotland, you would end up getting less in total than you do by a sensible, I think, is a very sensible clustering. And I think you cannot achieve equality of benefit, and nor should you try to do so, but effectively Scotland will benefit more by sensible targeting and clustering the way it appears at the moment. And Scotland as a whole will benefit, and therefore the revenues and the income and the wage earners will, those benefits will stay in Scotland and spread. But to try and spread your transport and investment uniformly so everyone gets a small benefit would be less effective in the round than targeting it the way it has been done, in my opinion.
Okay. Anyone else have a view on that? Professor Gorman and then Mr. Holt.
I certainly do have a view on that. One of the things that we found, I'm doing a report at the moment with the Royal Society of Edinburgh on digital participation, one of the things we found is that demand is higher in places that are rural, all other things being equal. And in fact, the local authority area that has the highest take-up of broadband in Scotland is Shetland Islands. And Shetland Islands has fantastic broadband because they're connected via the Faroes to Iceland as well as to the UK system, so they have some competition at that level that we don't see elsewhere. And I was very pleased to see Apeliar streamed internationally at a rate which I don't think we could have managed from any venue in Edinburgh from Mariel in Shetland a couple of nights ago. So that's a good example, but then if we go to the Western Isles, to Orkney and to the Inner Isles, then we find that there's no competition whatsoever. There is the step change happening, but the point I made before is that in those areas there will be a monopoly. In the towns there's competition. So in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Dundee and Aberdeen there's competition, so that lots of things can happen, but you really need to open the network up so that the remote places can benefit in the same way as the rest of Scotland does. So I think without doing that, there will be a continuing geographic divide.
Sorry, yes, Professor Guchin. Oh, sorry, Mr. Holding, you wanted to come in next, didn't you? Sorry.
No,
it was. I mean, I think, Chair, in terms of the answer to the second question was almost hinted at in your own comment on the first one, that building capacity within local authorities to deliver better performance. I mean, actually what we're seeing, the sort of postcode lottery that we see about the good things happening across Scotland is the problem. It really does depend where you live. And one of the greatest weaknesses, I think, in the planning framework is that it's just a bit too vague in the performance area. I mean, there's the whole area of, like, you know, I looked at, particularly when I was looking at the sort of connectivity to Elgin and thinking, how will I know if this has been achieved, you know, with A96? It's just so vague. I mean, what's this about? It's about reducing travel times to the Central Belt, it's reducing travel times to Inverness and Aberdeen. And what I'm saying is just actually, can we not be a bit more specific? And if we're a bit more specific, then we can go back and say, did it work? And to me, you know, plans are often there, and everyone will try and use them, say, oh, how can I get my development through here? How can I make a bit of money there? The more specific we can make them, the more effective they'll be. And if we look back to NPF2, you know, the list of projects was what a lot of people focused on. I think if, you know, it's not just about, you know, we've got, yes, the general planning policies sitting alongside this, but the NPF is a great opportunity to articulate in more performance-led terms than some of the very vague stuff we've got. So it is this about, I think the analogy of not having slip ramps off motorways is a great one about the postcode lottery point. Is actually, no, we do want to look at who's connected up from where. And so I suppose back to my first point, are we actually thinking about, you know, I wouldn't advocate a national top-down, let's decide where our transport hubs are all going to be and who connects in where and how we connect up Scotland, because it is right that that's done locally and bottom up. But are we enabling our local authorities by ensuring that they have actually designated these hubs around which the land use development will congregate, and that appropriate land use development will link with the transport network. So it's this a framework that says, you know, the following hubs will be established through the following process, or at least being a little bit more detailed. At the minute, it's just a wee bit too wishy-washy. And the critical word that was missing, interesting in paragraph, initially read, it started paragraph 5.8. Connectivity is not just about physical movement. I thought, well, that's completely incorrect. And I thought, oh, it's a Freudian slip. They actually mean connectivity is not just about enabling physical movement. And actually, the major theme that I think is missing throughout this is there's not much focus on how this document will enable the good things to happen. There's more about, here's what we think the good things are. And I think that's it's these enabling mechanisms, back to funding being one of them we talked about before, will actually make the difference in this, how do we make it happen in towns and cities and villages and islands, and, you know, it's those enabling mechanisms. I think a lot more detail would help.
Hey, Professor Gooch.
Okay, thanks. Looking at the focus which is in the document on renewable energy and to quite a large extent offshore renewable energy, I think there's a very good spread of investment around Scotland. And of course, it by its own nature, it is somewhat limited to the coasts of Scotland. But if you look at it from that perspective, then I think there's really a very impressive spread of investment planned around the coast of Scotland. It's not just Aberdeen, it's not just Edinburgh, it's the Orkneys, it's the West Coast. I think that's definitely a very positive aspect. And of course, we have a newly formed institute in Dundee and Aberdeen, which is the Institute for Renewable Energy. So we look forward to being able to provide input to this in the future.
Okay, Mr. Lauder.
Thank you. We welcome a number of the points in the chapter in section 5. Rural areas will be more accessible. Particularly, it's really welcome to see that point 526 is talking about having encouraging settlements, at least one in each local authority area in a rural area, to be more friendly to walking and cycling. And I think this is a sensitive issue which we've touched on in this committee many times, which is the perception that in rural areas, because of the distance between towns, active travel in terms of walking and cycling is an irrelevance, when in fact, of course, many small rural market towns and others are very heavily congested, and there's lots of problems around the school gates, just as we saw in East Lothian, where the council is now banning cars from in the streets around a number of primary schools at pick-up and drop-off time. So I think point 526 is particularly welcome. I also think that there are some points in point 524 and 525 where Sustrans has been asked by the government to be part of the A9, for example, dualling process, looking at how towns along the A9 corridor can benefit from the dualling by having greater facilities and better infrastructure, and also in point 524 where we're working with Network Rail to look at accessibility of stations along the borders line. I think that's, so if those points could be added, I think that would be welcome. In general, I think I actually welcome the thrust of this, which is saying that active travelling is as relevant in rural areas as it is in what we think of as urban in terms of big cities, big towns, and the central belt of Scotland.
Yes.
Can I just add to my previous answer and to pick up the point about digital? I really welcome the inclusion of digital in a document about infrastructure and transport, which normally would have been an entirely separate document. So the point about spreading the benefit, I think, is almost the opposite of the cluster, is that the wider you can spread the digital investment, the better, because those are the people who will benefit from not having to travel. No matter how much you spend in some of those communities, it's still going to be a long way to get to the central belt. So if they don't have to travel because they've now got good digital, can join meetings by video conference and so forth, I think it's much better than trying to get them an equally good dual carriageway all the way to Wester Ross.
Okay, and finally from me at the moment, what are someone already mentioned this, but what are your views on the intention to develop 5 main airports within Scotland? Is it a bit about right for our size and geography, or Mr. Matthews? Yes,
as you recognise, I've commented briefly on this already. If I could just point to the relevant section 5.34, states whilst air travel accounts for some 12% of Scottish transport emissions, in the long term a shift in emphasis towards low carbon options and digital links, supported by aspirations for high-speed rail links to London, will play a role in offsetting emissions. So on one hand, as I said, we we seem to have a case where we have master plans in place for these airports already, but beyond that, they're deemed to be national priority projects. Then that seems to be arguing at the same time, given that the aspiration is for a low-carbon, sustainable economy in Scotland, arguing that various things will come into play over the next 20, 30 years, which will actually offset the rise in demand for air travel as well. And I think there's an inherent contradiction in that position. In that, on one hand, one is talking about significant expansion across all 5 airports, and then that there could be potential for significant mitigation against growth in those airports, and recognising as well the carbon impact of that. So I think my further comment would just be about the consistency between the Scottish Government's climate change commitments, between its other aspirations and its assessment of what the demand will be. Is demand going to grow, or is demand not going to grow?
But is it contradictory? Because, you know, if we can get people to travel by rail from Glasgow to and Edinburgh to London on high-speed rail, that would be great. That would reduce the domestic airlines. But surely there's an argument for having international routes from these airports to stop planes having to land and commuters having to change airlines.
But if we're saying that...
Not commuters, but,
if we're saying that high-speed rail, which is one of the national projects to be identified in it, is going to come on stream, if we're saying that information technology has been alluded to already can play a role in offsetting the need to travel, which I think is becoming increasingly apparent as well, then why the need for major expansion at all 5 airports as well? I mean,
international routes.
But surely if more travel domestically, i.e. within the UK, is going to be by high-speed rail, extra slots become available through that process as well. Is there therefore, I'm just saying, that seems to be suggesting, 5.34 seems to be suggesting that over long term we can contain the growth of airports, but at the same time it's arguing for expansion at all 5 airports. And I just question whether those numbers actually stack up. We know the actual projections that have come out from some of the Scottish airports and compared to the reality of growth have been very significantly out in the last decade or so. I would question the underpinning of that. That's what I'm saying.
Anyone else have a view on that? Yes, Mr. Hunt.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very easy to think about modes in isolation, but I mean, certainly looking at Orkney, for example, the lowest carbon mode of travel from Orkney to the mainlands by air. So trying to tick box in terms of numbers of airports or anti-air or pro-rail or bus or whatever, I mean, I just can't, I don't see the world in that modally divided up way. I see it in terms of, can people get access to services? Can people get access to work? Can people get access to the international, business when they're working? And if we don't know that, then we're not really championing the public interest. And I think the primary role of government in transport is to ensure that every citizen can and business can achieve their successful potential by being able to do those things. So that's my starting point in all of this. Do we need more air travel? Well, when we look at this carbon footprints, and if the full environmental footprint of aviation was to be added to the costs of aviation travel, we still see growth in aviation. Actually, aviation market growth globally is quite resilient to additional costs. So to me, I think the big issues, exactly how fast it'll grow, we don't know. Should we reserve space for growth? Perhaps. I think the issue for me is that we've not really started to capture the full environmental costs within all transport modes in the way that we must do in order to achieve a sustainable. The growth is not going to come, economic growth is not going to come from pumping more and more out of the production and consumption economy. We just consume the planet. Economic growth is going to come from adding value to what we have, i.e. the other part of the circular economy, the upwards bit. And it's in that space that I think we could do a lot more in aviation, as we can with all of the modes, to close down the waste, close down the efficiency. And if that means people need to pay a little bit more for, that actually, I think will, you know, from the analysis we do of aviation markets, we see, yes, it'll have an impact, but it won't have as big an impact as, say, higher costs would have on bus travel, for example. So what I'm saying is there's different modes that are sensitive to that. Yes, you might suppress a bit of aviation demand with slightly higher costs. I think there's big steps to go. So again, it's back to what we pay for, how we pay for it, and where we really think our economic growth is going to come for. And I think the vision in the framework is great. That's what we want to achieve. If that's what we want to achieve, let's apply it in the way we fund and develop our systems, and that might include expansion.
Okay, Professor Gooch.
I think looking at this planning framework, it's quite clear that there's a focus on the development of relative new industries like the renewables industry. That is not just a Scottish or a UK industry. That is definitely a global reach. And in this respect, I think obviously the airports are completely necessary, because we're not just looking at the transport between Scotland and London. We're looking at the opportunity to bring in business people from all parts of the world to see what's happening in Scotland. So that in that case, I would say that yes, it's a sensible. But I would agree with too about the carbon footprint and so on and so on. But in order to create jobs and employment possibilities with, for example, the renewables, this is a vital part. People have to be able to get into the country to see what's happening.
Art, did you want to come in on this? Sorry.
Yeah, it was just on the subject of airports. They've been given national priority status, and that is, I quote, to provide a gateway to Scotland and in particular to the city network. In previous national planning framework documents, under airport enhancement, surface access improvements have always featured highly. Members think there's a conflict where surface access improvement has been dropped from this document, and yet the focus still seems to be to connect Scotland to the wider world through its airports and link to the city network. That there's a conflict there.
Mr. Holding and Mr. Connolly. Mr. Holding first and then Mr. Connolly.
The whole surface access to airports issue is back to the key point making about integrating the information systems. I mean, airports around the world, I mean, if we look at, for example, Glasgow Airport to Paisley-Gilmer Street as a bus running every 2 minutes type stuff, you know, actually we've got excellent rail access to Glasgow Airport, but we don't treat that as part of the airport. We don't manage it effectively, and provided the information is there, and that the customers, unfamiliar travellers, often coming out not quite sure where to go, can get straight on to efficient transport around the world in every country that deals with airports of the sort of demands that we've currently got at you know, even the biggest airports like Glasgow and Edinburgh. So are airports also good places for transport hubs? That's a different question, because often they are, and there are issues about, say, Edinburgh Airport as a transport hub that would cut out, you know, travelling into the centre of a city and connecting with going north and all sorts of stuff. So there are different questions about should airports be more than just surface access to the airport from where. It's about do they need to be transport hubs, or from do we need connections like a connection to a city centre from Glasgow Airport or whatever. It's a very different thing, because I don't think anyone would argue, let's say, Glasgow Airport would be the transport hub west of Glasgow. There are questions about whether Edinburgh Airport could be a transport hub, a more important transport hub west of Edinburgh. So I think, you know, it's about how we plan it, and I don't think we are effectively yet planning this whole, back to the previous point about hubs and spokes and how we see the town centres and their role around Scotland. I just don't see that in the transport planning that's going on because of a disjoint between national and local government transport planning.
Okay, can we just maybe, if you can just hold your comments and maybe try and get them in on another question. Jim, if we can move on.
In fact, I think we could probably stay with this subject, if that's okay. I'm keen to explore this idea of the contradiction between different government objectives that I think Mr Matthews was alluding to. So if the objective of government is to grow the economy, then you could make a very strong case for expanding the number of direct flights to key markets within the global economy. And I'm thinking from a past life of the fact that the biggest market for pharmaceutical medicines and medical devices and diagnostics is probably the United States of America and Canada. And so that would make the case, because we've got a growing life sciences sector in Scotland, working, companies working in partnership with their universities. That would make the case for expanding the number of direct flights to those markets. And then there's a point that Professor Gooch made about the renewable industry is global. And so there'd be a case perhaps for expanding those flights into those markets and thinking of other parts of the world. But if the objective is to reduce our carbon emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 to the extent of an 80% reduction, and transport provides 25% of those carbon emissions, then that would act as a brake on the objective of economic growth. So how do we reconcile what are, on the face of it, contradictory objectives on the part of government? That would be my kind of opening question to the panel. And I've got some specific questions on the active travel aspects of decarbonisation. Does anyone want to pick up that?
I haven't had the possibility to look into these statistics. You're saying it's 25% of the carbon emissions from travel.
I think that was a statistic that Mr.
Martin I could imagine that a large percentage of that is travel in and around Scotland. It's local travel in that case. And I think there's enormous things that could be done about local travel around Scotland. To give an example, I've been at the University of Dundee for a few years now, coming from Scandinavia, and I'm just amazed that there's so little cycling of the 20,000 students in that city. And I think that one of the reasons, obviously, is because it's dangerous. There simply aren't cycle paths to go on to, whereas in many of the Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, there are cycle paths specifically for students, which would bring down a lot of that kind of transport. And in the planning framework, there's a very nice discussion about cycle paths and walking paths on a more national scale, in between areas, and 20 kilometres here and 20 kilometres there. But I think a lot of that transport, and especially the emissions, is within the cities. Taxi ranks with the motors on all the day long and so on, those kind of things. And I think that's one of the things that I lack in this programme. It is the development of cycle and walking paths within the cities, and specifically within the cities which have large student populations who could be encouraged to do that. So it depends where that 25%, what the percentage is for. There's no alternative to air travel if you want to get abroad, long distances. But there are alternatives to short distance travel or medium distance travel within Scotland.
And then Mr. Connolly.
Could I come back to the airports? And although I'm sort of out of my comfort zone, you asked about the scale of the country and the scale of the airports, and 5 airports. And if the objective really is to encourage international air travel, then I think spreading one's bets over 5 airports cannot be the best way to do that. If you look at Amsterdam, it is an international airport hub. And many people fly into Holland. Holland doesn't have lots of other airports that many people fly into. It has Amsterdam. And I think one would have to place one's bets securely on this will be the international hub, because there are all sorts of economies for the airlines in making a hub where they can exchange passengers between different flights, for having the economies of scale in terms of handling the passengers, handling the baggage. All of these things mean that I cannot imagine a world where we'd have 5 airports that had significant international links. Yes, a few European ones, but if you really want to make that a strategy, you need to focus your bets, I would say.
Mr. Connolly?
Yes, I would just pick that up, that what you need is the connections from the hub airport, let's think of it as Edinburgh, so that you can get on, you step off your plane onto a train that goes at a European speed rather than sort of clickety-clack, and gets to Dundee or gets to Inverness or gets to Aberdeen, and focus your international flight. I also, to go back to the point about the carbon, it's not a problem people flying if they're flying somewhere else and all you're doing is getting to Friday Scotland rather than somewhere else. It's only a carbon issue if you're actively generating more flights, and therefore, by implication, more flying. And I think the danger of expanding an airport is you generate more flights of Scottish residents to sunny places in the summer, rather than looking at your business trips and your business connections and your links to America, and potentially, obviously, bringing in tourists. But if you expand an airport, the evidence, if you look at the departures board in Edinburgh, you see a lot of flights going to holiday-type destinations, which is almost certainly more flying than was being done when there wasn't room for the airport was smaller. So if you build a bigger airport, you need to make sure that the extra flying that is generated is good for the business and potentially bringing in visitors rather than just allowing people to get cheaper or an additional flight or an additional holiday. Can I also go back to the point about connectivity in airports? I think the whole journey, I think separating surface access from airports is a mistake. I think if you're coming in on business and you get to the airport and don't know how to get or can't find the way to your meeting or to the city centre, or get on a taxi and fall into a pothole somewhere at the gate of the airport because the link hasn't been made, I think that's a very bad perception that you have to get your surface access by all modes connected to your airports, and anything that separates that should be avoided.
Mr. Matthews?
Sorry, I made some points about airports already. Just a couple of things to add to that. As I said, quarter of all transport emissions all emissions are from transport, carbon emissions in Scotland. The figure for aviation is about 12% of Scotland's transport-related emissions just now, but as Mr. Reedy has said, obviously we have an 80% reduction target by 2050, 42% by 2020. And the question is, the more you grow one sector, for example aviation, the further you have to achieve the reductions elsewhere if you're actually going to hold those targets. So it's a big challenge. I'd echo a lot of the points made by others about thinking about connectivity within Scotland and also within the UK, high-speed rail potentially to offset emissions for travel to London and the south. One thing we're advocating as a national priority within the MPF would be the enhancement of the Scottish intercity rail network, particularly the links up to Aberdeen and Inverness. I think that could play a major role, and we've done a lot of studies recently showing how receptive business is to using rail now, because with new technology one can work in the railways in a way one can't on the cars. So there's big economic gains there potentially. And I think the last point I'd just like to make is around thinking about within cities how we move, and this has been touched on already. About 2/3 of journeys are under 5 kilometres within our cities. Huge scope there for expansion of cycling and walking and public transport for those that are less mobile. Massive positive benefits for health from doing so, massive benefits in terms of quality environment. And in terms of successful economies, I think if you look around European cities, comparable cities, say like Copenhagen, some of the Dutch cities, Stockholm, etc., that have embraced positive policies towards cycling and walking. Copenhagen, 30% of journeys by bike, 25% of journeys on foot within a big urban area as big as Glasgow. Big health benefits, big economic benefits. And these are the places increasingly, I think, that inward investment comes to. These are the places that people choose to live in because they're attractive and successful places to live in. And I think the vision has to be about that. Of course, there's a global dimension, of course, a part of the global economy, but we can do an awful lot within Scotland to help cut our emissions by thinking in a more creative way and sensible way about our transport links within the country.
Okay, Mr. Lauder.
What Mr. Matthews said, I would endorse. While I have welcomed the inclusion of the long-distance walking and cycling networks, and I still do, a major reason for me doing that is that those networks are used for short trips as well as they are for long-distance recreational touring and riding. And where they exist, particularly the National Cycle Network, they should provide a really good, realistic option for anyone. The plan is anyone aged 8 to 80 to cycle at a slow pace, and they should be a panacea, actually, where they exist. Now, they're not a panacea. The network doesn't work perfectly, but it is there. And the endorsement within this framework is to be really welcomed, because it should take the National Cycle Network and other networks a step forward. What I would suggest, however, following to your point, Mr. Reedy, is that point 413, were it to become a national planning priority and part of this framework, everything that Professor Gooch has touched on is within point 413. It talks there about rolling out the Designing Streets policy, which is a great government policy, really good, and would make a difference to the urban realm, both whether it's in a small market town or it's in a big city. In addition, citing the Cycling Action Plan for Scotland is totally welcome. And it might be that, if you like, was promoted to the Premier League and moved into this document. Forgive me for the football metaphor. But anyway, that, I think, encapsulates what the Professor is saying. I don't necessarily share your point that cycling is dangerous. I think for every man sitting... Well, for every man sitting...
Conversations offline.
to finish my point, it's more dangerous for every man around this table not to take regular physical exercise than it is to... and cycling is a great way to do that. I do it every day. And while deaths are rising from cycling, we don't know exactly why, but one correlation might be that there are more people doing it. And that's, if we can roll out 0.413, we might make this a far more welcome and good environment for people to take regular physical exercise, which would do them all good.
Briefly, Mr. Holding. Yes.
Just very briefly, back to this whole point about hubs. Aviation hubs, there maybe be 2 or 3 in Europe. The question is, will the UK have a hub? We're not going to have a hub in Scotland, or do we want one anyway? What I'm saying, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, they're battling out for the European hubs. So what we need is good aviation connections. But the hubs thinking applies just as much at a local level. And this is, again, back to our work on the Smarter Travel work that was published last year. Even in the 7 pilot towns, you could stand at the end of their 4-year development programmes outside many of the houses within these towns and say, and would you really ask a 12-year-old to walk to the shops? And of course you wouldn't. It's not safe. So regardless of the cycle safety issue, let's just look at the reality of living in Scotland today, and I think that's Professor Gooch's point, that as it were, this contrasts with many other countries in the world. And what's more, however, the changes that were made in these towns led to behaviour change that saved, on average, compared with other towns in Scotland, more than £60 a household. Now, that pays for a £500 million investment in transport. This is economic growth, this is success, this is people not making unnecessary car journeys, just walking to the shops when they can, regenerating our towns and all this stuff. So what I would say is, in the review, the Spice briefing note, it was like saying, oh, have a look at what was thought of the suggestions made, and things like, oh, safe routes to shops, safe routes to stations, safe routes to school, a local issue for local authorities. Well, maybe it is, but it's a national disgrace where we are at the minute. And what I'm saying is, if a national planning framework can't do something to enable, back to this enabling point, the local authorities to succeed on this agenda, which they've been struggling on for so long, then I don't think we've got the right framework. So I think it's back to these key points. The national framework must be an enabling document.
Okay, have all your points been answered, Jim, or can you roll them up?
Asked one question.
Well, can you roll them up, maybe?
Yeah, sure. I mean, thank you to the panel. I think they've made a good stab at reconciling what appeared at first to be irreconcilable objectives between economic growth and decarbonisation of transport. I've got a couple of specifics on active travel. I think a number of the members of the panel have made a very good case for why we need to invest in active travel and in cycling. I think, Mr. Lauder, you mentioned the health benefits. I want to refer specifically to your evidence. I think it's always good to have an evidence base when we're trying to inform the development of policy. And one of the things you say in your evidence is that using the World Health Organisation's Health Economic Assessment tool, the value of the mean annual health benefits attributable to walking and cycling are estimated to be 23.2 million for walking and 48.3 million for cycling trips. Now, these are quite big figures. I mean, in an ideal world, being able to pocket that money for cycling investment would be great, but it's not as simple as that, is it?
Well, absolutely, and I mean that's a respected assessment tool, and those figures are submitted to us annually to Transport Scotland's Sustainable Transport team, who provide funding for the National Cycle Network. But I accept the fact that's a long-term gain, and it's not actual fiscal benefit. Where investment in networks like the Long Distance Walking Network or the National Cycle Network do create real spend, I suppose, is in the tourism and recreation spend. And in fact, a report that came out last year by Transform Scotland estimated, and it's in the evidence there, estimates that the real spend is getting on for 230 million a year. And that's, generally speaking, from the evidence that was gathered, it's not visitors who are spending that money, it's actual residents of Scotland themselves who are going out and about for short trips or daily journeys and are spending money on that network. Now, there are figures also available from SNH, who've been looking at the long-distance walking element, that are very similar to that. There are also figures from Scottish Canals, who do also obviously have a good resource for walking too, and cycling, that feed into that. So that's where, if you like, there's a spin-off from that benefit, not just from the long-term health benefit, not just from the benefit of reducing congestion, and as Derek says, improving the public realm and everything else that goes with that. There is actually a real fiscal spend, and we've got a good project just now running between Oban and Ballachulish in Argyll, where anecdotally local hoteliers and B&B owners are now saying that about 1 in 5 of their guests is coming either expecting to be able to cycle, or they're coming with a bicycle to go out on a trip. And that's real spend.
There's a commitment within the framework to a national long-distance cycling and walking network. I rather thought we already had that through the National Cycle Network, or at least part of it. Given that your organisation is involved in that initiative, is there anything you'd like to say on that?
Well, the comment I would make is that yes, there is a national cycling network. As I've mentioned before, it's not perfect. There are significant gaps. Some of them are set out here. Others that we've submitted to the team who were gathering evidence from the framework on a longer term basis. There are long distance walking networks as well. What we've not had so far is if you like, cohesion between them, to bring them all together and to then in particular market them as a cohesion, which the Norwegians have done really effectively. They've talked about Norway's Great Trails project, which has brought in significant tourism, both domestic tourism and visitors. So I think what I welcome in this is, it doesn't say it specifically, but the intention would be from Scottish Natural Heritage, Sustrans, Scottish Canals, to continue the work that we've done together to bring better cohesion between all these networks, and in addition to highlight those significant gaps in the network where things do break down because of gaps in the network that are required to be plugged in terms of new infrastructure.
Okay. Paragraph 5.26 of the framework, there's a commitment to encourage local authorities to identify one walking and cycling friendly settlement where accessibility will be significantly improved by 2030. I'd like comments and feedback on the 2030 timescale, whether that's realistic or ambitious enough, but also you in your evidence, or rather Sustrans in their evidence, have a recommendation of one exemplar walking and cycling friendly settlement. So that seems to be very much in keeping with the thinking of the framework. My question would be, what more can we do to encourage that development and to embed that within our local authorities and our local communities? Can you see that a role for perhaps an award, that local authorities would compete against each other for the prestige and recognition of having an award for an exemplar project, and that through that we might actually have local authorities competing to do the best?
More concise, please. We're really running out of time.
Okay, I'll try and be as concise as I can, Chair. I would never suggest that local authorities like to win awards, but if there was one, they might well want to do that. What I think is really useful would be, as I said at the opening of my evidence, if Section 413 and 526 could be combined, I think that would be very powerful. I don't understand the 2030 date. It doesn't fit in with the Cycling Action Plan, which is to have 10% of trips by bike by 2020. So I think that's, maybe it's a typing error, I don't know, but that needs to be investigated. I think it's a great idea to have one town per local authority, irrespective of whether it's an urban, rural, suburban, mixed rural authority, where walking and cycling is really invested, and we focus at what we've got. And there are good pilots, Derek's mentioned some, there are others that could be built upon. Funding, of course, is always the issue. However, what we're seeing is that the new funding that the Transport Minister found to push forward the Cycling Action Plan was significant. It's £20 million in new money. It's being delivered through our Community Links project, and we're seeing real appetite from local authorities to bid in for that. That's a good sign, and I hope it shows that there's a real appetite for even more. So if you invest in more, remember that 20 million is match funded, 50-50 by the local authorities. So that is a 40%, will be a £40 million spend over the next couple of years. But the time scale is odd, but the aspiration is the right one.
That's fine. Mark, can we move on to your questions, please?
Yeah. Just to ask members of the panel if you think that the government has identified the right transport and digital infrastructure developments as national priorities, and if not, if there are any alternatives that you would suggest? Very
quickly, I'll just repeat that I think that where things would be markedly improved for active travelling would be to combine 413 with 526.
Anyone else, Mr. Matthews?
Yes, I won't repeat some of the things I've said already. I think my views on the airport's inclusion is quite clear. Again, just to reiterate, I think we'd support the extension of the support for the rural cycle and walking network, which we're very much in favour of, to a consideration about urban routes as well. We support, or we certainly don't object to high-speed rail, but we think the focus should be much more on the intercity rail network within Scotland, the electrification of that, the upgrade of that. I think that's something that has been recognised by the business community and many others is not necessarily fit for purpose in terms of journey times and so on just now. So we'd like to see investment there. And as already also touched on, there are 3 port infrastructure projects included, but there's nothing on rail freight. And I think rail freight economically and in terms of its environmental impact could be a significant enhancement to the Scottish economy. And we'd like to see something in there on that.
Just back to this point of funding, I just don't think we should be setting priorities in the absence of looking at the money. I mean, we, 10 years ago, did an analysis for Highland Council and Highland Enterprise on development in Inner Murray Firth, when we were saying, well, depending on the rate of growth there will depend on what transport investment is needed. And you could put £5,000 on each new house opened or whatever as a transport fee to help fund roads or railways or whatever and this sort of thing. It's not happening because the presumption is, oh, it's in the national planning framework, it's going to happen, but then there's no actual money to do it. We end up bankrupting the transport budget, doing stuff that maybe wasn't anybody's top priority just because we've got this haphazard approach to linking land use and transport planning. We actually need to think, if we're going to have this development in and around Firth, we need lots of investment in the transport links to Inverness. And that's, the two are linked. And we shouldn't be trying to separate this stuff. So priorities are about funding, and this applies almost more. I mean, one of the concerns I've got about another 40 million or whatever in the local walking, and something that's still not embedded in the natural practice when new houses are built, when new supermarkets are built. If we were levering the developer contributions out there, as we do on roads, then we would actually have the money to rebuild our towns, and not some of the towns by 2030, but all of the towns by 2020. I think that's what we've got to be saying. I mean, let's join the modern world. Come on. People have got to be able to walk around the towns. That's where I am on this.
Hope you'll take that message to developers then. Mark, carry on.
Thanks, Convener. The plan policy states a need for digital fibre network, which says that development will be construction of new broadband cabling where length of cabling exceeds 8 kilometres. Do you think that's enough to fill the gaps across Scotland? And do you think that it provides enough detail to hit the next generation broadband goals for 2015 and 2020?
That's very difficult to answer because there's no transparency yet on what will be delivered by step change. I was just jotting something down when I heard about Oban to Ballacoolish cycleway. In here there's a mention of we could integrate putting cables, fibres in with things like provision of cycleways. That 33 miles, I bet it wasn't done, and had it been done, it would make a huge difference to Ballacoolish, because I do know, because
anyone would do it, that BT is going to have presence, they already do, but they're going to have better presence in Oban. I very much doubt they will have better presence in Balakulish. So those kinds of things are useful. I could not understand the 8 kilometres. Sometimes, if you've got a mountain in the way and you can't reach something by radio, then going 3 kilometres can make a huge difference. So I don't understand where the 8 kilometres came from. But I suppose you have to say it's not nationally important when it's too short, so 8 kilometres is one way of doing it. I think it would be useful to think through the detail of, it's not just a matter of having this fibre in the ground. Who does it belong to? Who operates it? Who's able to access it? Those are the things you need to be asking. And until we've got that in the plan, it's very difficult to see how it all hangs together until BT opens up about what access they will provide at the roughly 50 hubs that the step change programme is going to allow. Nobody else can do anything because they don't know where they are, and even if they did know where they are, they don't know how much it will cost to access them and what they'll get when they do. So it's very difficult.
Okay, you finished, Mark? Thank you. Alex, you've got some questions.
Yes. A number of my questions have been answered, but there's a couple of key points I'd like to bring out. They were all aware that a digital fibre network on a national scale will make a big difference to connectivity. However, I notice in paragraph 5.28, there's a brief mention of the priority for digital infrastructure, both fixed and mobile, and then mobile doesn't get mentioned again. Do you think we're missing a trick here by not having more within the plan to talk about how we can give mobile access?
I think if the mobile operators have access to the fibre, then they have every incentive to put connections in if they can get that access at reasonable cost. I did see in the consultation document, I think, that led up to this, a lot of talk about mobile masts and planning and so forth, which is certainly necessary, but it seems to me it's far more important to focus on the fibre at this point, and that if you put the fibre there, then you enable the mobile delivery. Without the fibre, you can't get the connection to the remote places where the mobile delivery can then be built. So I'd say the balance here is good, actually.
Mm-hmm. If there's no other comment on that, the other thing I wanted to clear up was the fact that we are at the moment working our way through a plan for improving digital connectivity across Scotland, and yet there is always the problem that technology advances, and the concern is that the quality of what we're currently putting in the ground is appropriate to deal with future needs of residents and businesses. So basically, is what we're doing today, is what's in this plan future-proof?
The bit that's putting in fibre, the diagram here of the 1,200 kilometres that BT is putting in under step change, is future-proof. The connections that then go from there to individual houses are still largely going to be copper, and they will be limited by the length of the copper in terms of what they can deliver. And those aren't future-proof. There may come a time when you have to put fibre to the houses, or make the copper shorter, which means digging up roads again and getting closer to the houses at least than you currently are.
Rather than look at alternative technologies today?
There are the competing technologies today are copper, wireless and fibre. Where there are small communities, wireless can certainly do an awful lot, but you're limited by the availability of spectrum, so you're all sharing the same airspace. So that only works with small communities. Then between copper and fibre, in terms of technological performance, fibre is just wins, and copper can only go so far, quite literally, where so far is probably under a kilometre. At the moment, the reason we're using copper is because it's there, because it was put in for the telephones. In some countries, they're replacing all of it, and if we could do that, it would be good to do, but it's very expensive. So I don't think that bit is future-proof.
Okay.
Right, okay, if we can move on to housing. Gordon, you've got some questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Convener. I want to touch upon aspects of housing, and in particular, Does the MPF3 provide sufficient guidance to planning authorities on where major housing developments should be located? And I'm interested in exploring, if possible, if you see any conflict between Scottish planning policy that states that redevelopment of urban and rural brownfield sites is preferred to development on greenfield sites, and planning advice which notes that it refers to marketability, where planning authorities discuss with housing providers what can be developed. Does anybody see any conflict in that?
Mr. Connolly.
Yes, I think there is not enough guidance on sustainable development and housing in particular. I think that this country continues to build, if it builds any houses at all, it builds them on green fields that the developer likes, with laid out for the car user, with not a facility within walking distance. There is not enough guidance on how to build properly, and there is reference to sort of building, living streets and so forth, but the whole how development should be laid out and the facilities that should be provided before the first resident moves into that house, and it's a house not designed for 2 cars and a drive and a link onto the nearest motorway. I think the guidance should have much stronger about the material, the energy levels, the building quality, the need for travel at all, and the ability and need to travel by car as opposed to more sustainable modes. I think it's probably one area where the plan is weakest, is that guidance, in my opinion.
Professor Foreman and then Professor Bramley.
Could I add a digital aspect to that? Many, both business parks and housing developments, are still being built without making provision for high-speed connection. And that's an opportunity to put in something that's future-proof, whereas it often happens at the moment that we're still putting in copper when we build new things because there is no national guidance on it, there's no incentive for the provider to do it because it may mean upgrading the exchange before they can actually provide the new fibre. You need to make sure that what goes in with a new housing development, or particularly a new business development, is fibre to the premises, because that is what is future-proof, and it's something that could be done through planning.
Professor Bramley.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's not really the place of the national planning framework to be very prescriptive about exactly where new housing development should happen. That is the role of city-region plans. We have a planning system, and they are working on that, I think, reasonably effectively. Secondly, it's there is a very considerable need for additional housing in some parts of the country, and it is quite unrealistic to think that that can all be built on brownfield land, and it is, there is some greenfield land that is not no particular value in the sense that, it's not particularly high value ecologically or anything in its present use. It may be the best option, providing that housing to be in some cases on greenfield land. So it should not be some simplistic equation of brownfield and greenfield in terms of sustainability. I agree that, the thing, we should be aiming for higher standards and of development, but each case needs to be looked at in its merits. So on the issue of marketability, I would be suspicious of just asking developers to tell us about marketability. I think we should have our own independent assessment of the economics and viability of developments, and that should be what influences our decisions. In most parts of Scotland, housing development is viable, not in all areas, and that we shouldn't be just letting them cherry pick. The planning system should be determining where we're building. In some cases, that will involve changing the shapes of our cities and expanding onto green fields, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. But we should, and I think perhaps in the past, some of our stances have been a bit dishonest about that. I mean, certainly if Edinburgh is to expand to meet the growth targets, it will have to change its shape a bit and expand beyond its existing boundaries.
Mary, you had a small point.
Yes, specifically on the point of brownfield sites and greenfield sites, and I would be interested in the panel's views on land banking and what impact land banking has on local authorities being able to identify brownfield sites, or whether it's forcing local authorities to use greenfield sites because of the impact of land banking. And also in the SPP, the limits that's put on generous housing supply, what impact do you think that will also have on local authorities being forced to identify greenfield sites rather than brownfield for housing?
Mr Holding.
I just wanted to make a quick point about, I mean, we do a lot of work for developers and actually they're very simple. They largely just want to make money. And I think I turn it round and say, well, if it's easier for them to make money in greenfield sites than it is in brownfield sites, then that's what they're going to do. And from a transport, often coming at this from the transport perspective, it really grieves me to see so many brownfield sites having to be given up because local authorities are placing on them, you know, even places right next to railway stations and high transport access things, because the local authorities, oh, urban area, congestion here, let's load you with loads of transport costs, so the development becomes non-viable. And yet the same developer can develop a greenfield location and get loaded with next to nothing in terms, even though there's a far larger social and environmental footprint, that's not being charged to the developer. So I think there is some quite, you know, basic structural funding issue. Now, whether local authorities can do more to capture this for themselves by, you know, the way they manage land themselves, I think there's a lot of scope in there, but I'm not an expert. I'm sure Glenn's got a lot more expert view than me on that, so or somebody else. So I was just wanted to make that funding point about the incentives.
Mr Bramley, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think one should draw a distinction between developers and landowners. Developers are in a business of trying to convert land use, and they will try and make profits where they can. But I think what varies so enormously between different sites is the windfall gain that goes to the landowner. And at the moment, I don't think we have a very effective way of capturing that, as I think we should, to help to finance and pay for the kind of infrastructural support that those developments need. And I think this is one of the major challenges to get that mechanism working better. It might in some cases work better. I mean, I think it worked well in the past in new town development corporations, and I still think there is merit in that kind of model of a publicly accountable public development agency that processes the land, puts the infrastructure in, and then it's auctioned for development to developers who actually want to build it, rather than those that might want to bank it. And so I think it's worth keeping in reserve the possibility, or in some high growth hub areas, you know, that might be the right approach. I think it's unfortunate that some of the major development opportunities in Scotland, what was formerly public land, is now sitting in privatised organisations, you know, that was previously public land. So we've, in a sense, lost, but I think possibly there might be scope for creating legislative basis for that kind of development vehicle if it was needed. But I think the first requirement is to have a proper plan-led system where the planning system is determining where development is going to happen and in roughly what time sequence. And you know, and then if developers aren't willing to develop them, we should invoke sort of reserve powers or something then.
Talking about the housing situation, you've mentioned about maybe having to use Greenbelt with it, but people have raised concerns about infrastructure constraints, and you mentioned Edinburgh yourself. There are 4 arterial road routes into the west of the city. 3 of them are already reaching capacity at peak times, and a local CES plan has suggested that in the southeast of Scotland in the next 10 years to be another 107,000 houses to be built, most of them commutable into Edinburgh. How do we balance that between housing need and the constraints we've got on our infrastructure?
I think you again, Professor Bramley. That was
well. That is clearly the sort of, there's a gap in a sense between the different stories here, and that's why I think it is so important to look more assertively at the issue of recapturing the development gain and using that to help finance bridging some of that gap. Other colleagues here can comment on whether there are technical solutions to enabling development in that West Edinburgh area without completely further clogging up those key transport, but there probably need to be a combination of measures, including very much improving the cycling and the walking and the public transport access to those new development areas, and not just thinking in terms of road solutions. But I mean, if you look at the development economics, the residual land values, for every house that's built in that area, there will be hundreds of thousands of free development gain to the landowner. We should be capturing that to pay for this infrastructure.
Mr. Lauder.
Just in terms of the physical infrastructure as it goes down on the ground, I mentioned before, and it's in section 413, the excellent designing streets policy of government, which my understanding is enshrined within planning policy. Now, David has said, and no one has contradicted him, that developments are not encouraging people to walk, cycle for shorter trips, or are better accessed by public transport, which are all within designing streets. That policy was created to try and move away from the cul-de-sac developments that we've seen over the years. If that's not happening, then that's really quite concerning, and it maybe is worth a further look. And that's the point I would make on the purely practical, how the infrastructure works for people, because quite simply, if where you live encourages you to make a short trip by your car, that is what you will do. If you have a car, then that is what you will do. If, on the other hand, it gives you more options to walk, to cycle, to easily get a bus, or indeed a bus to a better public transport interchange, because in Northern Europe, the vast majority of cycle trips are simply to the next public transport interchange. They aren't place to place. They're people going to a station, going to a bus stop, and then making an onward trip. If we can't deliver the own policy we've got, which is the envy of other parts of the UK, then that's a really serious issue, I think.
Mr. Holding.
Yeah, absolutely critical issue here about, if we look at the incentives and pressures, say, on a hard-pressed local authority officer looking at a planning application, the risk and reward balance for him being seen to be the spoil sport that turns down a development on some basis that, well, the developer, we're going to take the curbs out and do it by designing streets principles or have it in a location. Actually, we don't have the incentives right at all. So I think this is what I'm saying about a national enabling framework must mean that that a typical officer in a local authority, roads and transport department, is perceived to have been more successful if they get the right thing to happen. And currently, I don't see that in practice from either side, either coming with the developer with the planning applications or when we work for government. And so I think it's back to what we were saying in the smarter travel work. We've got to get smarter at this. The bits that are missing in the Scottish economy is the added value we can get from underutilised resources. We did the transport analysis for the Edinburgh Structure Plan 2015, and I mean there are plenty underutilised resources. They aren't in West Edinburgh. If we want to build in West Edinburgh, we shouldn't rule it out, as John said, and others, Glenn said, we need pretty hefty fees. I mean, the Germans do this with a very nice national framework with everything zoned out. If you want to build a house here, it's going to cost you, X thousand euros and all this sort of stuff. And some framework that allows local authorities to succeed. I'm just observing from a consultant on the outside, the system isn't working because the wrong incentives are in place.
Mr. Connolly.
Tools are available for checking what the impact both in car traffic and other motorised modes are for different areas, and Sestran are very good at using those tools at not building their big developments where there is nothing but car or whatever, but the individual developments are still built too much for car, and it's not just about the walking paths and the cycle paths, it's about having facilities, the primary school and the decent shop there before the houses are, before the first resident gets there, so they get used to shopping at the local shop and not driving half a mile to the big Sainsbury's or the big Tesco's. So the planning is in this country is very weak, and it's weak because it has been focused on car access to the new houses for too long, basically.
And just last question. Are the housing and settlement policies and proposals in MPF 3 consistent with the government's climate change targets? And I'm thinking about the press release that came out for Friends of Air Scotland last week, which talks about polluted streets in Scotland. And we obviously have pressures in Aberdeen, Perth and Edinburgh in terms of housing. and yet we have streets in these three cities and in Glasgow and Dundee, etc., where we're failing the European standards in air quality, and that's before we build any more houses.
To answer? Mr. Connolly,
The plan is very short of mention of air quality, and I think it's actually a bigger... poor air quality is killing more people than road accidents in the UK and in Scotland. And from a national, you could say it's a local issue, local air quality is a local issue and therefore not national. But if the fines, if the EU start issuing fines, particularly for NO2 concentrations, that will become a national issue because they will be issued at the national level. So air quality is a big issue, but it's not the houses that's causing the air quality. So if you build your houses and people from those houses walk, cycle or take an existing bus, the houses have not added to the air quality problem. It is only a problem if you build houses where the traffic has to go through the centre of Perth to get to where it wants to go, or has to fight its way through Edinburgh because you haven't provided this whatever. So building houses does not affect air quality. Building houses at the end of a corridor which has poor air quality when all the jobs are at the other end without providing a tram or a bus or an underground or a system that doesn't generate air pollutants, traffic pollutants, is a problem. So it's not the houses, it's where you put them relative to where the residents are trying to get to.
Mr. Matthews and then Mr. Holding.
Yes, I'd echo a lot of what Mr. Connolly has said there. I think the interesting thing is if you use planning principles to try and address climate change impacts through transport, through thinking about location and the integration of new development, then you also do actually lead to benefits across a whole range of other areas. Air quality is a big problem in Scotland. It is affecting an awful lot of people, killing people prematurely in Scotland on a significant scale every year, and it should be a central concern of local and national government. I think what's striking, though, is that, albeit people have said that the guidance is fairly weak, it's not requiring the location of housing in the most suitable and sustainable locations, but it is clear in SPP and the planning policies, it is clear in MPF 3 about locating new development around decent public transport and integrating with walking and cycling. But the reality is that's not happening. If you look across central Scotland, across the M8 corridor, if you look around Aberdeen, which will be heightened further with the Aberdeen Western Peripheral route and the potential for new development around that. If you look even in one of the priority areas for the MPF 3, which is the Murray Firth corridor, the A96, that's predicated on the dualling of the A96 and development along that strip, which is very poorly served by public transport at the current time. So there is this discrepancy clearly across the country between the rhetoric and the reality of what's happening, and the impacts are not just on climate change, the impacts on air quality, on public health and other issues as well.
Do you briefly want to make a point, Mr. Holding?
Simply to say that, yeah, thank you. It's simply to say that the fundamental issue, I think, here is the ongoing dependence on the use of a car, even for quite short trips. We just haven't broken that yet in Scotland. We have all the right levers in place. I don't think we're giving them enough impetus to really succeed. And that's perhaps missing, yes, from this planning framework.
Got that message loud and clear, Mr. Holding.
Just one of the joined up bits we've not discussed around the low carbon economy is very important in this whole sphere, and I think particularly, I mean, you know, we look at any of the predictions, even the more pessimistic ones, certainly by 2020 to 2030, and stuff we're building now is going to have a longer shelf life than that. We're going to have electric vehicles, the dominant vehicles on the road network, and yet even modern housing that we're putting in today, we're not putting in that. So, I mean, even if we can't, unobtrusive, easy charging for vehicles near to all new housing should be an absolute must, and yet it's not embedded in the system. Secondly, the opportunities for energy storage through electric vehicles are, you know, so don't just put in the charging point, put in the smart meter, or put in the capabilities, so that effectively consumers are buying our, you know, Scotland's energy storage, and by buying Scotland's energy storage, we've then got enough, and it makes renewable energy so much more viable. So this win-win-win was all the way through there, and it's whenever these multiple wins that you look and there's complete silence because it's cross-sectoral and it seems to be difficult. Now, if we can't put it in the national planning framework, where can we put put it would be the sort of thing I'd be saying. So let's say, you know, it's got to be in planning guidance, it's sort of there, but no detail about how to do it, and it's just not happening. And day to day, the planning applications going through today haven't got effective charging facilities, never mind the idea of feeding the energy back into the grid.
Mary, did you have a quick point on this?
A very, very brief point. Edinburgh, Perth and Aberdeen are identified as the areas with the most acute housing requirements. But there is, of course, an issue in rural areas for affordable housing supply. Do you think there's enough in the NPF3 to actually help solve the problem of rural housing?
Anyone got a view?
I didn't see anything in it about rural housing, so by implication, no, there isn't.
Okay, that's quick enough. Adam, can you do your questions on water, please?
Yes. In the context of infrastructure constraints on development, does NPF 3 pay sufficient regard to water and sewerage development?
Is that your area, Professor Gooch?
I think it is, isn't it? Well, I'd just like to repeat the point that I made earlier, because when we're talking about water, we're also talking about flood control. We're also talking about development in Glasgow and so on, and the runoff and how that can be managed. And although it is mentioned in the framework planning here, I don't think it's clear enough understanding of the mechanisms of flooding and runoff from water in that case. I think there needs to be those different points need to be connected a little more clearly. There is work about the river basin management plans, which of course is the starting point of water supply and wastewater disposal in these areas. There is mention about ecosystem services, which of course also are central for water supply and for water management. But they need to be connected a little bit more clearly than they are in the document today.
Anyone else? No?
Okay. Second question, final question really, is do you think the proposed framework furthers the Scottish Government's Hydro Nation agenda?
Question?
How does this NPF 3 further the Scottish Government's Hydro Nation agenda?
Sorry. Well, I think it does very strongly, because there is a focus on renewable energy, offshore energy. There is a focus on hydropower. There is a focus on the expertise of Scottish companies within these fields, which of course is one of the central aspects of the Hydro Nation. I personally see it as consisting of, on the one hand, the expertise of the companies, on the other hand, the expertise in management and governance. Those are the two sides. And I think the document does push that forward, and especially, I think, as I say, the renewable energies, which is based a lot of it on water of some kind, if it's seawater or fresh water, is in there. Absolutely. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why I was pushing the point that we do need the airports, because if Scotland is to develop as a hydro nation, it has to be able to bring people in to show them. You can't do everything by video conferences. I think there's quite a strong link, but once again, the links between them is not sufficiently clear. The fact that it's the catchment management that's a starting point for a lot of things in the hydro nation.
Is there anything else about water that you would like to bring to the committee's attention? Oh,
I was just going to speaking as a civil engineer that gets involved in, you know, a range of these things. I mean, certainly the whole fact that in terms of as a storage, tidal storage, not just in land, we don't do nearly enough yet with tidal and renewable energy, and we certainly see an awful lot more of that coming through, and certainly you know, what the French were doing on sort of tidal storage a few years can be improved, and the economics of that quite dramatically around Scotland's coast. So there's a lot to do in this space, and it doesn't get the attention that I think it needs. So I think we need to remember, looking at sort of civil engineering history, that the only reason we've got the current generation of hydro there is most of them were put through under war powers, which were stronger in terms of planning and easier to do things. Now, you know, so planning is a very important process for both being enabling and disabling what goes on. So, you know, national plans and frameworks are important to help make these things happen, because, you know, we've seen, I mean, I'm not a big supporter of the Severn barrage, but we really shouldn't be looking there for tidal, estuary storage, however we want to use that type of hydro project. There are many, many less environmentally sensitive locations around the coast that could be used for that sort of thing. So just chip that in.
Okay. Just one small comment here. Probably not a very popular comment as regards the companies who are working within bottled water, but I think that Scotland, with the quality of the drinking water that is here, if that was spread more widely, we could save a great deal of energy, of transport, of packaging and so on, if we could make it quite clear that the Scottish water is often of a better quality than the bottled water that you're paying for, that you're taking your car to fetch from the supermarket. I don't think we market it enough.
Okay, that's a good positive point to end on. Hopefully, do any committee members have any further questions? Gentlemen, any other final comments? Yes.
Can I make a very short one here? and I'm not sure if it's relevant, but what I missed a lot in this document was any discussion about waste management. And whatever we think about waste, it is being produced and it is a resource. We have a company in Scotland who's using bottles, for example, to create filters for water quality. But we also have the possibility of actually using waste to generate electricity. Now, I know it's not carbon low electricity or heating, but waste can be used to produce energy, connecting it with, for example, district heating systems in order to be able to provide reasonably cheap, and then we're using that as a resource, because that is something, I think, this loop that we've been talking about, there's a gap. What happens with the waste? It just at the moment seems to go out of the system where it should be brought back into the system in one way or the other.
There were more crosses in the Institution of Civil Engineers State of the Nation report under waste than any of the other categories that we were looking at, waste and energy and transport. We might moan about transport. It was of the best of the major civil engineering areas. We were thinking, energy, will the lights go out? Maybe. So what I'm saying is have a look at that type of, scorecard, national planning frameworks. Waste is a really important one to get right.
Just very quickly. The waste can be used for biomethane, which can be used as a fuel for your vehicles as well. So if you can combine that, you've cut your fossil fuel and you have a lot less air pollution from your burning biomethane rather than diesel. And the point about the health benefits being a bit intangible, they're more tangible than the travel time savings or whatever, because they actually are money. They're being saved somewhere else, but it is actually money rather than just a person's perceiving a 3-minute quicker drive up the A9 or whatever. So don't discount the health benefits from your walking and cycling. Point that was made earlier.
Okay, gentlemen, that's been very informative indeed. Sorry if it's felt a bit rushed. We have gone over the allocated time, but it's all been very useful, and thank you very much again for coming. I'm going to suspend the meeting shortly for the witnesses to leave, the new ones to come, and for members to have a short break. Okay, if we can resume our meeting, agenda item 3 is the Housing Scotland Bill. We're going to hear evidence today from private landlord representative groups on the Housing Bill. So can I welcome John Blackwood, Policy and Parliamentary Affairs Director for the Scottish Association of Landlords, and Sarah Jane Ling, Director of Policy and Parliamentary Affairs for Scottish Land and Estates. And can I also welcome Patrick Harvey, who's joining us for this session. Adam, can I ask you to start off, please?
Surely. Good morning. With regard to housing, the Scottish Government's vision is that all people in Scotland live in high-quality, sustainable homes that they can afford and that meet their needs. Now, to what extent do you think that the Bill's provisions furthers or promotes that vision?
Can I kick off? Is that okay? With regards to, from our perspective as a Scottish Association of Landlords, we see some positive things within this. It's about redressed access to justice effectively. We also see an introduction of the potential letting agent registration. All of these things effectively helping the consumer to take redress if they feel that they need to do so. So overall, we believe that that can only increase the quality, the standard of both physical condition and management of properties in Scotland.
Just to support what John said, we believe that the bill will help to increase standards and deliver the aims of the bill. This is really just the next step on a long process that both landlords and tenants organisations and the Scottish Parliament has been working towards for a number of years. And as John has already highlighted, a number of these provisions within the bill will help to deliver the aims which we're looking for.
Good. The only other question that I have is with regards to the consultation process for the bill. Were you satisfied with that, with the processes that were established for the bill, and how did you participate? What are your reflections on that consultation?
I feel that the consultation process was very inclusive, and we were able to participate as an organisation through the stakeholder group, but also there were a number of opportunities for individual landlords, certainly our members, to participate. Over the last 2 years, there have been a number of routes, both in terms of policy objectives and also in terms of particular provisions within the bill that have been consulted on. So we're entirely happy with the consultation process.
And likewise, we would say the same. There's a number of things in this bill that we've been campaigning for some years, so we're delighted it's eventually, hopefully, coming into legislation.
Thank you.
Jim, would you like to ask
Thank you,
your question?
Convener. I have a couple of questions in relation to the private rented sector, and that is obviously the bill makes provision to transfer certain types of civil court actions in relation to the private rented sector from the jurisdiction of the Sheriff Court to the jurisdiction of a first-tier tribunal. I thought, first of all, it would be useful to know what your experience as landlords has been in taking civil actions through the Sheriff Courts, and what are the problems in relation to access to justice, and then to ask whether you agree with the proposal to transfer the jurisdiction from the Sheriff Court to the first-tier tribunal in relation to the private rented sector. So the experience today, and then whether you agree with the proposal, and what the benefits to landlords and tenants would be.
Okay. The experience to date has been pretty unsatisfactory. We provided a number of pieces of evidence to Scottish Government and to the Parliament over the last few years. I think it's in terms of process, speed. I mean, or lack of speed, I should say, in terms of consideration of cases. Lack of specialist housing knowledge within the court system has been a huge issue for landlords, and lack of confidence in the court system to deliver an adequate outcome within a defined timescale. I think in terms of the way forward, initially we had wanted as an organisation to see the court system we have improved. We always feel that if there's improvements identified, then it makes sense to actually carry out those improvements. And certainly when we looked at the Gill review, we did think that there were a number of recommendations in there which could result in improvements. However, after discussing it with the Scottish Government and others, we are bought into the tribunal method. and do feel that if a tribunal method is going to be taken forward, then the one which is set out in the bill is the most appropriate one to follow.
And again, I largely agree with that. The current system through the Sheriff Court system is it's expensive for a start, it's cumbersome. There's inconsistencies in decisions that have been taken as well, and certainly there's a lack of expertise within the current system. So and again, we've been campaigning for this for a number of years, is we need a specialist housing court tribunal, effectively, to deal with these issues. And we already have a couple of others which already exist in Scotland, which are respected and can easily be built upon. And we would think would be more cost effective to the public purse and give better access to justice where required.
Cost effective and better access to justice, but can you just say a little bit more about what the benefits to tenants and landlords would be from your perspective?
One of the main things is about the speed in actually getting there in the first place, to actually get to the Sheriff Court, depending, it's very much a postcode lottery where you live in Scotland. And lots of landlords and tenants alike really feel that it's too adversarial. We need another system that's really looking at perhaps taking a more holistic approach to dealing with the issues that are faced by both the landlord and the tenant and dealing with that housing issue. So we think a tribunal service would be much more appropriate, and where appropriate mediation could be provided, as we already have in the existing tribunal services as well.
I think the additional point, I'd agree with everything that John said, but there is a financial benefit to landlords in terms of, especially rent arrear cases. The time it's spent in court means that the rent arrears continue to increase as we go through. If the tribunal works in the way it should, I do think there will be financial benefits to a landlord to having those cases resolved in a much, much quicker process.
Okay, that's very helpful. I've got one final further question, Convener, and that is in relation to houses in multiple occupancy and the licensing process that operates in relation to that. The bill doesn't transfer civil cases from the Sheriff Courts to the first tier tribunal. Rather, it gives ministers an enabling power to do so at a later date, and the Scottish Government has given a commitment to consult further on that issue. What are your views, and would you be open-minded on that transfer taking place at a later stage?
We would certainly encourage it. We believe it's important that the tribunal would deal with all private rented housing cases, which would include HMO cases. We believe the reason for it is because it wasn't really consulted upon at the time, but we would have no issues with it being transferred at all.
I would echo those thoughts. We would actually have no issues with it included in the provisions of this bill. So we don't even want to wait till a later date. We do, like John said, we'd like to see it all brought together.
Thank you.
Gordon?
Okay, thanks, Convener. To continue on the theme of the tribunal, it's been suggested that the Scottish Government may provide support to access the proposed tribunal, possibly through legal aid or an advocacy service. And I'm just wondering if you have any views on what the policy should be around access to legal aid and expenses, and you touched upon the location of tribunals.
Certainly, I believe there needs to be more work done as to actually the cost benefits. I believe overall it will be cheaper to the public purse. We know that from existing experience with tribunals. Access is important, and an opportunity for especially tenants who are vulnerable to be able to have an advocacy service is even more so important. So I think that any system needs to have that built in it. I think that's very important, and that's for all. That's for landlords, that's for tenants, all users of the service effectively. They do, where appropriate, they should be able to access any kind of advice and support and information as well that they need.
I think, again, I agree with what John said. I think we're very conscious that what we don't want to create is a system where legal representation becomes the norm. So where it's required, it has to be there, but we don't want to create a system where it does become a business and it becomes the norm.
It's also been suggested that there could be scope for the tribunal to charge a fee. I just wonder what your views are on that.
and it would depend on what the fee would be, as you can imagine. But at the end of the day, there is a current charging system in place with the share of court system. And again, we would be open to having a look at that once that's been properly costed in a tribunal service. I think the main thing is, let's not get too bogged down in the actual charging process or who pays for what. It's more the fact that there is a system which is effective, it's robust, and is easily accessed by all, and where all users, landlords, tenants alike, feel that it's there listening to their case in their best interests. And I think that's important. And I believe tribunals can do that better than the traditional court services.
What is important is having an effective system, and if it's deemed to be necessary to have a fee to make sure that system then operates effectively, then we would not object to that.
And my final question is, we've heard at previous evidence sessions from Shelter Scotland and the Government Law Centre that the tenancy regime in the private rented sector should be changed to give tenants more rights. Again, what would your view be on that?
Do you want me to go first?
I think the shelter proposals probably are much more complex than just giving tenants more rights. I mean, if you look at them in detail, they're actually looking at making the tenancy regime work in a more effective way. I don't think landlords' representatives would argue for that. I think in achieving that effectiveness is where we disagree with Shelter on. Their view is very much that we should remove the short assured tenancy and move to an assured tenancy basis. But we have been able to provide evidence that short assured tenancy is used largely for two reasons. One is flexibility for both parties. And certainly we have evidence where landlords have tried to offer longer tenancies to tenants and they haven't actually wanted it. But the other thing is, I mentioned the lack of confidence in the sector, in the court system earlier. If you have lack of confidence in getting back your property because of rent arrears or for other reasons, then your default position will be a short assured tenancy. If we can create that confidence, then I do think that the sector will change in terms of length of tenancy provided and possibly even a move to an assured tenancy. But it's very much a change through confidence rather than a change through regulation.
And again, just concurring with that, but I think an important message to get across is we do support the current short assured tenancy regime. There's been previous research carried out by the Scottish Government on that, which has backed that up, that both landlords and tenants feel that that's in their interests, and indeed there's been recent work done on that too. So the Scottish Government's actually actively involved in reviewing that and getting all stakeholders' interests in that. I think there is an issue, though, at looking at the system. There's grounds for repossession. Certainly as landlords, we feel they're not strong enough. We hear often from communities about cases of antisocial behaviour and how landlords really feel disempowered, really, to be able to take action through the courts, and local communities feel that nobody's doing anything about it. So there is an issue there, perhaps more so than there was 30 years ago, when the legislation was first introduced. So we need to look at that and see that how can we actually perhaps modernise the service without actually throwing the baby out with the bathwater. The current system actually does work.
Thanks very much.
Patrick, did you have a question in this bit?
Thank you very much, Convener. Obviously, as organisations who want to see bad practice driven out of the sector, and I'm sure that's something that's shared by all stakeholders, one of the concerns is that even if the tribunal system works well as a system, there's a big disincentive for people to raise an issue in the first place. If they have a complaint and they feel that they can be given a month's notice to quit, they're not going to raise that complaint. If you're not convinced about Shelter's proposal on security of tenure, what's the other way, what's a better way of removing that barrier and ensuring that people can raise concerns, kind of the confidence to challenge bad practice where it exists without feeling that they're going to lose their home?
I think if I can go first on that one, I think one of the issues is about tenants getting used to the service and feeling it is there, it is accessible, it is an accessible service. I believe one of the issues is it's not publicised enough, tenants aren't aware of it, that it can't be done. I know lots of tenants are actually accessing the service once they have been issued with notice to quit. So we know that they do continue, and current private rented housing panel is able to continue cases even though those tenants have been given notice. So we believe it needs to be used more, but perhaps that's through information, advice and support that's given to tenants. And likewise with landlords, they too need to have confidence in the service. So I think it's still a new system. The tribunals that we have only recently been introduced, and many people out there are still not aware that they actually exist. So I think they do a good job, and it's an important thing to have, but it's about making sure that everybody's aware of it and that they can access it, and there's no legal or financial barriers to them doing so.
There may be no legal or financial barriers, but if they still feel, I'm going to lose my home, that's obviously a barrier that's very difficult to overcome.
It can be. I question how much perhaps that is an issue for some of the tenants taking those cases to the tribunal, because certainly that's not what I've seen actually going through the tribunal so far. But perhaps they're put off before even approaching the tribunal. But we don't know that, I'm afraid. I don't see much evidence of that actually at the moment. I'm sure it must happen. Well, but the point is we need to have a system whereby people feel, I don't know if security of tenure alone is an issue to address that point. I think it's about having confidence in the system actually dealing with it. As I said, we often have tenants who have already been given notice to quit, so their security is gone, but they still pursue cases through the PRHP because they want to see their matter addressed. And I think that's an important message to get across.
Well, I'm sure I'm not the only member who's had these concerns raised by constituents who I don't think are making it up, but thank you very much, Convener, for the opportunity to ask the question.
Okay. If we move on to you, Mark, you've got some other issues relating to private rented housing matters.
Yep. Just to ask what your views are on the bill's provision to allow third-party applications by local authorities to the private rented housing panel to enforce the repairing standard.
We are wholly supportive of the proposals contained within the bill.
I think that's a very positive step, and that would help some tenants who feel perhaps personally that they feel disenfranchised about actually going forward. That would allow local authorities to take on the cases for them effectively.
Is there any other action that you think would be required to improve physical standards in the private rented sector?
I think overall there needs to be greater enforcement of the legislation that we have. I think that's largely what we're seeing as the problem. Landlord registration is not enforced. It's something we've said many times. It's not enforced properly by our local authorities, and often that's put down to a resourcing issue. Even with cases going forward to the tribunals that we have at the moment. Is anybody really enforcing that, looking at that, taking further action against the landlord as a result of these cases? We're not seeing that. So we need to make sure the legislation that we have, not only can people access it, but it actually has teeth and is properly enforced. So that's a big issue for us.
So do you agree with the government intention to bring forward provision in at stage 2? Round about providing enhanced discretionary powers for local authorities to designate enhanced enforcement areas to tackle poor standards in private rented housing?
Absolutely. No problem with that at all.
That approach actually was something we had originally suggested a number of years ago in terms of actually focusing where those problems have been identified, in terms of focusing limited resources. So certainly we have no problems with that going forward.
Final last question, do you agree with Shelter Scotland to have suggested that carbon monoxide alarms should become mandatory through all private rented properties in Scotland?
Yes.
And again, we have no issue, and there's an issue about electrical safety as well, which should be taken into consideration as well. So these things are recommended at the moment, but there's no legal requirement to have these things done. So it's in everybody's interest to make sure that properties are as safe as possible.
So you'd be quite happy to see issues relating to electrical safety as well as carbon monoxide, making that mandatory?
Indeed, and we're on record in supporting that as a proposal.
Okay. You finished, Mark? Yeah. Okay, we move on then to Mary.
Thank you, Convener. Part 4 of the bill provides for the regulation of letting agents through the establishment of a register of agents. and the necessity for agents to pass a fit and proper test. Do you agree with that general policy approach of the regulatory framework? And if so, what benefits do you think it will have both for landlords and for tenants?
Yes, certainly we agree. I think it's long overdue, effectively. There was always a question whether this Parliament had jurisdiction to deal with it, so we're delighted that it's felt it does, and that can be progressed now. Certainly we've heard for a long time from landlords, and indeed tenants are saying the same, that somebody could set up an office in the high street of the local town, the local community, and they don't need to be regulated by anybody at all. They can set up as a letting agent, they can take rent, they can carry out repairs in properties, they can take deposits, and nobody's checking that. Ultimately, the landlord is the legally responsible person, but equally landlords are saying, but surely that shouldn't be right that somebody could set up a business, because they're assuming somebody somewhere has checked them, at least trading standards at some point. And of course there's always been that anomaly. So hopefully through this system, and again we need to make sure it's properly enforced, it does have teeth, we'll make sure that if you are a letting agent that you are properly checked, you are registered, and there's a fit and proper person check done there on those individuals. I think there are issues when you're checking out companies as opposed to individuals. What could happen at the moment, and it's a concern we have and obviously we would like to share, is that you could have an agent who literally has run away with the tenants' deposits, the landlord's rents that have been taken, and literally could close down one night in that high street, in that office, and set up a new office in the same high street the next day under a new name, a new trading name, and there's nothing that can be done about those individuals. Now that's wrong, and that has actually happened a number of times in Scotland. So I think as part of the fit and proper person test, we need to take into consideration previous offences carried out by the principals of the company, as well as perhaps the company name itself, if it's a legal entity in its own right. So I think there are issues about how we enforce that fit and proper person test when we're dealing with legal entities, i.e. companies.
Okay.
Yeah, as John said, I think both organisations are on record by saying we actually support these proposals. Landlords as well as tenants have suffered through bad practice from letting agents, and we don't oppose these proposals at all. Where we do have an issue is in terms of the definition of what a letting agent is. Under the terms of the Antisocial Behaviour Act, a tenant farmer is deemed to be a letting agent from a landlord, for the head landlord. So what we don't want to do is then impose duties on a tenant farmer who in reality isn't acting as a letting agent because he's defined as an agent in another piece of legislation. So it's really just about the definition, because I think what we're talking about is targeting those people who are performing a letting agent service on a commercial basis here. So we have to make sure that those people are targeted.
And if I may, Convener, that there's an issue as well about people acting as agents being registered as agents through the landlord registration system, voluntarily as agents, who might be relatives of the landlord. For instance, the mother who's managing the property because her son's in the forces overseas or working overseas, maybe even just temporarily for a year. Then I think we need to look at that. Does that individual need to be registered through this proposed scheme? They're not doing it commercially. You could still argue it's part of their business and acting as the landlord, but where do we draw the line with regards to agents, and what do we define an agent as being? And we do know that a similar approach has been taken with the Property Factors Act, and it does define it as in the course of your business, but that could be anybody who's just maintaining the common stair to fix the front door. In the course of their business, they are doing that. We don't want to deter people actually doing repairs and improvements. They're not getting paid to do that. They're just taking the onus to do it, and everybody's in agreement. So we need to make sure that we're not disenfranchising some individuals or executors dealing with estates as well, all of whom are regarded as agents.
And of course, a code of practice will be developed. Do you think some of the concerns that you've raised could be covered in that code of practice? And do you think there's other elements that should be included in the code of practice?
I think all the issues regarding good practice, and we're looking at the the unfair fees, the widespread bad practice, yes, that's absolutely fine. I think the issues with definition would have to be dealt with through legislation rather than the yeah.
We welcome the consultation on what the code will be. The Scottish Government is committed to consulting on that. There's a range of things that our own organisation has been looking at, is that should agents have professional indemnity insurance, for instance, you know, all of these sort of things, which as a commercial outfit you would expect, I would think, and would be to the consumer's interest. Again, I would question whether that would be appropriate in the case of a family relative managing a property on behalf of someone else.
And what measures do you think the Scottish Government should undertake to ensure that letting agents, tenants and private landlords are aware of the registration requirements?
It largely comes down to good publicity, to be perfectly honest. We had the same argument and the same issues with landlord registration. It's a bit easier with commercial firms because letting agents are easier to identify. They tend to be more visible in our high streets and our local communities, and they're advertising the properties at some point. So they're more or less easier to access. So, but again, it's about making sure that that information is proportionate and is targeted. And again, people are aware that enforcement action will be taken. That there seems to be a culture out there at the moment in our sector where, well, nobody does anything about it anyway, so it doesn't really matter whether you're registered or not, which is not good news for good agents. There's many good agents out there doing a really good job, and they feel, well, you know, we're always the one that has to pay the dues and sign up to everything, but nobody's chasing the bad ones. So we need to make sure that the bad ones are being chased, and we believe that's in all consumers' interests, tenants and landlords alike.
I think lack of awareness has been an issue with all new regulation for the tenancy sector, and I think one of the issues that has been that we have the plethora of bills and acts and new legislation. So I think there is a lack of awareness not just amongst tenants but amongst landlords. The Scottish Government has to be commended. They've spent a lot of time and effort trying to raise awareness. Where we have found, or where we find that there's been the most success, is where actions taking place at quite a local level. So if you look at somewhere like Scottish Borders Council, for example, who really took ownership of the awareness-raising aspect of this. So it was radio campaigns, it was campaigns within their letting pages of the local papers. That seems to have had much more success than the national or nationwide campaigns. So it's something that I think that all of us within the sector have a role to play. It's certainly not just down to the Scottish Government to raise awareness.
If I may come back on that point as well, I think an important thing to emphasise is that agents also welcome this. They believe this is a good positive step to legitimising their businesses. You know, letting agents are not regarded in society as perhaps being the best of the bunch out there in providing a service to our local communities. So those who are doing a good service welcome registration, and I think this is a good thing. Hopefully it will distinguish them from others, but at least overall to the industry, I think it's a positive step in legitimising what actually is already a very good service that's out there. We need to make sure it continues to be so, and is seen to be so.
Do you think the proposals will provide landlords and tenants with easy access to a redress mechanism that will help to resolve disputes between landlords and tenants? Or letting agents and tenants?
I think it will, but I think it, as part of the system, I think on its own, if you looked at it on a standalone measure, then I'd have concerns. But I think linked in with the new tribunal, I do think it will.
Exactly. You know, I think it's only a positive step. There is an issue for many tenants as to who they feel they're contracting the service from, because effectively they're getting the property from the landlord, so the agent's the middleman, but the agent hasn't entered into any contract with that particular tenant. Tenants are not aware of that. There's nobody informing them of that, and perhaps making them aware of their rights and what they can do if something goes wrong. But equally, they could have a gripe with the agent as opposed to the landlord, just as the landlord might have. And often with this middleman, if they're not communicating properly with both the landlord clients and the tenants of those landlords, then that's where things start to go wrong. So if there's a redress mechanism, then at least experts can get round the table and have a really look at that situation and see where perhaps bad practice is happening and how that can be stopped or changed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just add, do you think, you know, there are possibly cases where the mechanism to resolve disputes just won't resolve the dispute. Do you think there are penalties, or should there be more penalties in terms of rogue landlords and rogue letting agents, you know, to really hammer home the point that you have to be up there with the best? Otherwise, we're not going to get any improvement in the relationship between tenants and landlords and improvements to the properties and the way landlords deal with their tenants.
I think, Convener, that John touched on the point before. I don't think we need more penalties. I think we need more enforcement of the penalties that, or more use of penalties we have, and more profile given to penalising that bad behaviour.
Okay. I think that's true. We don't have any regulation for letting agents at the moment, so anything is welcome. But the point is, we've got a number of bits of legislation in place at the moment that are just not being enforced. So there's an issue about it being enforced and it being publicised that it is being enforced. And that's a very strong message we could send to landlords and agents alike.
Yes, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Convener. This issue about enforcement of existing legislation has come up, I think, 2 or 3 times during the session. And I wonder if there's room for a bit more for this bill to be doing to achieve that, particularly in relation to the deposit system. The deposit protection system. I have honestly lost count of the number of people who've contacted me, tenants who've contacted me, to say either that they're being denied information by, it has to be said, most often the letting agent, sometimes a landlord, denied information that they should be entitled to. They've not been told whether their deposit has been protected. In many cases, people being told that they're getting other kinds of charges or fees or so-called advanced rent, and it's not really a deposit, it's a deposit in all but name. And the Scottish Government apparently isn't still able to gauge how much compliance there is with the deposit protection system. What could we be doing, the Government, either through policy, the code of practice, or through the legislation itself, to actually get this system working better and to prevent, I'm sure the minority of bad agents or landlords finding workarounds rather than complying with the spirit of the system?
I think there's a couple of points there to pick up, Convener. The first thing about the scale of compliance, I do think that the number, the level of deposits held within Scotland was overestimated to begin with, both in terms of the numbers of deposits held and also the level of deposits held. We certainly made representation at the time that we had canvassed our members. We knew that only about 50% of our members actually took deposits. But I think when they looked at the sector as a whole, they assumed that that figure was much higher. So I think that's why they're struggling to gauge what the level of non-compliance actually is. Just like we had some discrepancy in the level of non-compliance with registration because we actually underestimated the level of landlords in Scotland. However, there is no excuse at all for non-compliance with tenancy deposit scheme regulations if you take a deposit. There's already regulations in place to say any other fees are illegal. I mean, we know that's there. Again, it goes back to enforcement. The local authorities, through the landlord registration process, can take everything like that into account. And it should be that more instances are being fed into the landlord registration process and questions are being asked, is this landlord a fit and proper person? And we have no problems at all with that being used as relevant information. But there is no excuse for non-compliance with tenancy deposit scheme standards.
And again, just to concur, I think it is very difficult for us to gauge the numbers out there because we still don't know how many private landlords are out there. We're only going on how many have actually registered. So on the assumption the majority have registered, then from that figure we're seeing how many have taken or have lodged deposits. And often we come to this conclusion that everybody takes a deposit, but especially in rural communities in Scotland, we find that's not the case. Deposits are not taken. So it's always difficult to know.
It is pretty clear that there are letting agents, including large, very professional letting agents, that simply stop calling it a deposit and start calling it advance rent, and tenants find that they're essentially in the same position that they were with what's effectively a deposit, entirely unprotected.
development fee or something like that.
Yeah. I think there is an issue with advance rent, that advance rent isn't a deposit, and I would take issue with that because it is only covering rent in the property. It's not actually covering any damage or any deductions that the landlord could make. But I can understand that the principle...
In some cases it is used for that, and if you're a tenant who's being told, OK, we're not going to charge a deposit anymore, but your advance rent's going from 1 month to 2 months, and if you leave, then we'll give you some of that back if you haven't damaged the property. It's a deposit in all but name. It's a workaround.
If they're saying that you would get something back if there's no damage at the end of the tenancy, then that's a deposit by name. So I'm talking about where it's genuine cases of advance rent. That does happen, in fairness. It's always happened, and we shouldn't automatically confuse the two. But certainly, obviously, with any system, we argued that this would be a problem if tenancy deposits were brought in. We said that people will find a way around this. There will always be a way around it. And
I'm asking, how do we stop that? How do we crack down on that kind of behaviour?
Well, I think a good way could be through the new tribunal service, because at the moment, going to taking summary cause action through the sheriff court system is not easy for tenants to do. They're not aware that they can often do that. I think they could be more aware of that if we get this right through the tribunal service, and it should be an easier access service for them as well. So I think that would be a positive step rather than going through the cumbersome role of going through the sheriff court system. I think that would be a positive step there in the right direction. But I'm afraid we are where we are.
If they have the confidence to do it without thinking, I'm going to lose my home. We're back to that issue of security.
Although many are doing it because often they don't find that it's not protected until the end of the tenancy. So the tenancies naturally come to an end, or the tenants wanting to move out. And then it's only then when they're researching everything, they realise my landlord never lodged this or letting agent in the first place. And even beyond the end of the tenancy, the legislation is such is that they've still got 3 months whereby they could go and make a claim against their landlord. I think a big issue, if I may, is that many letting agents have not complied with the law. And that's disenfranchised the landlords they're acting for, because the landlords are liable in law, but the agent isn't, and that's wrong. So they've been hiding behind that. So I think that's a major issue, and it's probably a bigger issue than we actually know.
Thank you, Convener.
If we move on to mobile home site licensing, Sarah Ann, I think it was your organisation's response to the Scottish Government's consultation on licensing of caravan sites indicated that it didn't believe that the proposed licensing of mobile home sites would be the best way of preventing rogue operators from continuing to operate. And I think you also had concerns about the fit and proper person test in relation to mobile home site owners and about the 3-year licensing period. Do you still hold these concerns, and if so, why?
I think our concerns relate very much to the operation of landlord registration. So it's built on our experience that the landlords who operate within the system and who are fit and proper are the first people to register, they're the first people to re-register in the 3 years, but the rogue landlords still have not registered. And our concern was very much that if we set up a similar system within the mobile homes, all that would happen is the ones where the parks already were being run to standards would be the first ones to register, and would already have re-registered before we'd actually targeted the ones that we're trying to raise standards. We have no problems at all with looking at ways in which to raise standards, but the system as laid out, I think we've seen has inadequacies. So we did wonder whether replicating a system which is almost aligned with landlord registration was the right way to go.
I've got a fair bit of experience in this area, and it seems to me that some local authorities are much better at having a system of registering and keeping tabs on mobile home sites than others. And to be fair, we're not talking about a huge number of sites throughout Scotland. So what are your concerns? I mean, the local authorities should know where their mobile sites are and who the ones are who have registered and who have not.
Well, certainly you would think that, but having worked in, I've worked in local authority in the private rented sector as well, and we did know where some of those bad landlords, even the bad landlords were, but the way the system was set up, it was very hard for local authorities to target the resources where they were required. So the focus, as I say, was very much on licensing the ones who were coming forward. I think certainly in terms of even the first round of HMO licensing, it was the same. I know we're not talking about the same numbers for mobile site homes, and if the local authorities are completely convinced that they know where all the mobile site homes are in Scotland, then we would have no issue with that.
Do you have any comments, Mr. Blackwood,
No,
on this?
it's not something within the remit of our organisation, so we don't have a comment on that.
Okay. Sarah Jane, I suppose this is to you as well. What are your views on the enforcement provisions on proposed site licensing? And, you know, maybe you've answered this question already. Do you think they're an effective deterrent to rogue site operators?
I think that the Scottish Government's proposals that have come forward do deliver. Certainly the terms of I think they refer to the term the polluter pays. I do think they've developed a system of sanctions where the person who is responsible and who should be sanctioned and fined would be through these proposals.
Okay, do you have any other general comments or anything on particular aspects of the provisions in the bill that you would like to see?
I think I have one in relation to the cost and certainly the cost impacts of the private rented sector tribunal. And John mentioned very much the costs of awareness raising, and I do think at times when we look at the impact of legislation, the costs of that awareness raising are an important part of the consideration. But also I would like some comfort that running the cost of a PRS tribunal in rural areas and allowing rural tenants and landlords to have access to the system has been taken fully into account.
Okay, do any members have any further questions? No. Okay, well, thank you very much. Yes.
Sorry, I was just going to add something in with regards to exemptions for letting agent registration. Is that certainly we feel, with the exception of the mother who's managing the property, then there should be no further exemptions. All agents should be classed as the same who are operating on a commercial basis.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you very much. And I suspend briefly to allow the witnesses to leave the room. We have one more item on our agenda today. Move swiftly on to agenda item 4, which is subordinate legislation. This is to consider a negative instrument on water and sewerage services to dwellings as listed on the agenda. This order makes each local authority, and not Scottish Water, responsible for the collection of the charges payable for water services and sewerage services which are provided by Scottish Water. This applies for the financial years from 1st April 2014 to the 31st of March 2018. The order also requires each authority to make payments to Scottish Water for the charges collected. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee determined that it didn't need to draw the instrument to the attention of Parliament. So the committee will now consider any issues that it wishes to raise in reporting to Parliament on the instrument. No motions to annul have been received in relation to this instrument. Do any members have any comments on this instrument? No? So is the committee agreed that it doesn't wish to make any comment, make any recommendation in relation to this instrument? That is agreed. Thank you very much. That ends our business for today. The next meeting of the committee will be on the 5th of February, when we'll hear evidence from the Minister for Local Government and Planning on MPF 3 and further evidence on the Housing Bill. We close the meeting.